Right, so with this instance of Blender still open, I'm going to open a second instance of Blender. So right click on the Blender on the taskbar, open a new one. I'm going to open up the robot that's walking along the curve. So click on that one. We've got this one, and the reason we're using the robot that walks along the curve is because if we go back to the main scene, you can see at the beginning the pavement is actually lower than the world axis. You can see the y-axis here is going above this point here. So we need to make sure that the character is not just walking along the flat 3D ground plane, but instead conforming to the terrain in the video, so it doesn't look like she's floating all over the place because she's higher up than the ground. So we'll go back over here to this one. I'm going to select everything. I don't want to bring the camera in, so I'll press B, and then with the middle mouse wheel held down, just drag over that to deselect it. I'll press Ctrl C to copy it, and I'll go back to this scene. We'll come out of camera view, and I'll paste this in. So Ctrl V, and that'll bring the robot in. And I don't want to use this curve, I'm going to create a new one. So I'll just click on the curve, and I'll delete it. I'll delete the donut now as well. We've got all this bump in the middle, which we don't really need. So I'm going to select all of it. Let's just move the character out of the way for a second. We need to use the triangle. So let's just move that. So all this stuff here, I don't need. So I'm just going to select it. Make sure I deselect the camera. I'm going to put it into its own container. So let's just come out of full screen. And I'll add a new workspace. Go with just a general layout so we can see the outliner. And then all this stuff here, I'm going to put into its own container. So press M, new collection, and I'll just call this bump, stuff we don't need. And then over here, I'll just hide all that. And then we'll grab this triangle and I'll press Alt G to put it back to its original position. So making sure the triangle is at world 0, its original position, we need to make sure that the path and the triangle have got the origin in exactly the same place. So just make sure your 3D cursor is at the same point as the triangle. So if you're not sure, just click on this, on the triangle, Shift S, and say cursor to selected. And then we'll go into top view. I'm going to add a path. So Shift A, curve, and then we'll choose path. I'll press F2 and I'll rename this to character path. I'll go into edit mode and I'm going to get rid of all the vertices except the first one, so X, delete vertices. I'm going to move this one to the 3D cursor, so Shift S, selection to cursor, and I'm going to move that path now until it's level. We go to turn on the motion tracking till it's level with the end of the path, which was this empty here. So just to make sure, we'll go into motion tracking. We'll come to a point on the timeline where that's in view. So just there, you see they've got the end of the path. We'll click on that. If it doesn't select it in the viewport, it's because you first need to select empty in the 3D viewport in object mode. Choose one, and then we'll click on this one. So it's selected it for us. Now let's go back into the layout screen. We'll choose the character path, into edit mode again, so we've got this vertex, we'll select it. I just want to move it now until it's level with this end empty. So GY, so moving it along the y-axis. And now I'm going to extend it this way, so E, and then Y again. So we've now got 2 points, one behind the camera. So the robot's going to walk to this point. Next up, we need to get this path to match the height of the path, the actual path in the footage. So obviously this end needs to be down here so that it doesn't slip around in midair. So in order to do this, I'm just going to go into select both vertices, still in edit mode, right click and say subdivide, and then I'm going to press Shift R to redo that. So Shift R, and you'll see we're getting more vertices appear, probably to about here, just so we've got enough resolution to get a nice curved path, maybe one more. So now we've finished the robot path, we can start modeling the actual geometric path to emulate the one that's in the video. So back into object mode, we'll do Shift A, I'm going to add a mesh and I'm going to make a plane. We'll go into edit mode, number 2, to go into edge mode, or you can click it up here. We'll choose this edge here, the end one, I'm just going to move this now across until it's about level with this empty. So go into top view, GY, and move that across as well. We'll take this one and move it so it's behind the camera. So anywhere there should be fine. I'll go into edit mode, still Control R, and we're going to add some more edges to give it a bit more resolution. So I'm using the scroll wheel to scroll upwards to add more edges. We'll go into the footage, and let me just show you what's going to be happening if we don't make this path stick exactly down to the ground. So let's play this back and go full screen. Watch the path. You see it's moving, it's looking as though it's moving differently to the ground. And that's basically, you can see it's moving across the flowers. It's just because it's at the wrong height. So if we go into edit mode, we can use the proportional editing and snapping to get the actual 3D geometry of the path to match with the height of the trackers that were placed along the path in the motion tracker. And setting snap into vertex mode will snap to those empties that represent the trackers in the 3D viewport. And if it helps, you can cross-reference with a camera view at the same time, just to make sure you're not making any mistakes. And now if we play it back, you'll see it's now sticking correctly. But we are still getting a little bit of movement, probably because we didn't have sufficient trackers along the path. So we've had to do a little bit of guesswork, particularly at the end where it slopes down. So I'll just undo this, and then what we'll do is create a load of trackers, but only for modelling purposes, not for actually interfering with the existing solve. So we'll go back to the motion tracker. I'm going to select all of the trackers we've got, so let's just unhide the disabled ones as well. Press A to select them all. Control L, that's going to lock them to make sure they're not involved in any future tracking that we're about to do. And then we'll hide them as well, so we can see more easily what's happening in the viewport. I'm going to come to a frame where we've got the pavement in full view, so about there. Maybe after we've got a lot of motion blur, maybe about here. And I'm going to go to the annotation section. I'm going to draw around the pavement, being careful not to get any high points like the grass or the weeds around the side of the path. Come to here, close that off. I'll do E, detect features, F9, and I'll say only inside the annotated area. I'm going to decrease the distance to something like 20, something quite low, so we get a lot of trackers. Then just click anywhere and get rid of the ones that it's made a mistake on. So B, then we can drag select, delete those. Right, so we're left with these. What we can do now is track these forward. Make sure we select them, E, track markers forward. We don't need to go too far, that should be fine. Or maybe a bit further, just to be safe. So keep tracking forward a bit. And that should be fine. So we're starting to get, I think we're starting to get a few problems there where they're bunching up at the edge. So just to here, I'm going to clear forward. So I'll select them all, E, and then clear track path forward. So we'll get rid of all that data where they're starting to stick to the tree. What we can do now is we can solve this, but the issue is, with these new markers, it might really mess up the solve error, because we didn't really pay that much attention. And we've also got a few down at the bottom there, which aren't actually moving. So I'm going to just use the old tool we used before. We'll come into the cleanup section, frames less than 2, and just delete them. And then if we solve, it might, you never know, it might improve the error rate, but it's probably going to make it worse. So solve camera motion, and it's made it worse. So we'll undo that. And what I'm going to do instead is select all these trackers, and I want them to appear in the 3D scene, but I don't want them to influence the solve error. So what we can do, with all of them selected, we can Alt click on the weight. So it's very important to hold the Alt key down. That will make sure that whatever you enter in here now will affect all of the trackers that you've got selected. So I'll press 0, and now if we solve, you should see, if we're zooming over here, that these markers are going to appear, but the solve error should stay the same. So solve camera motion, 0.65, it improved it a little bit. But more importantly, we've got all of these additional markers that we can now use to help us more easily get the pavement to the correct height. So again, using the proportional editing and the snapping, I'll just get this pavement to line up with the empties that I've created along that path. So now that it should be conforming more accurately to the height of the path in the video, we'll just slide it across a bit so that it also matches the positioning horizontally. Let's just have a look. Play this back. I think actually we need to rotate the camera just a tad. So come out of edit mode for the path, choose the camera, make sure the 3D cursor is at world 0 and that you've got the 3D cursor set as the pivot point. And we can now rotate the camera a little bit on the Z axis, so the global Z axis. Again, make sure this is set to global. So RZ, just rotate the camera now until the pavement seems a bit more in line. And then, all being well, we play this back and I'll just choose this and make it a little bit thinner. So G, X, turn off proportional editing by pressing O, or click it here, GX. We'll bring this in, just so I can test if there's any movement. Zoom out a bit, press play. And now it seems to be sticking pretty much perfectly all the way down the path. Yeah, so that seems good. So next up, we're going to grab the robot and put it onto the path. So add to edit mode. We'll choose the path that we created earlier. We'll go into the layout view now. The character path. And in this view, we can now close, just have one window. We want the character path to stick to the pavement. So with the path selected, into the modifiers, we'll choose shrink wrap. We'll hover over the target box and press E, click the pavement, and now that's going to stick to the pavement. The next thing we need to do is choose the little triangle we've got, and we can turn these markers off now in the view. So motion tracking, turn those off. We'll just rename this to triangle so it's easier to find. And we need to give this a curve to stick to. If you remember from when we brought it in from the last animation, this curve modifier is what controls the placement along the path of the triangle. So we've only got one path, we can just click on this and choose character path. And it should go now to the beginning. The problem is, you'll see here, that although it's walking along the path, it's not walking on the path. And this is because the modifier here is actually not recognizing that this curve has got a shrink wrap modifier. So what we need to do is apply the shrink wrap modifier on the curve, and then the character will go down to the ground. If we play this back now, we'll walk along the ground perfectly. We go into camera view, go back to the first frame. We see the characters walking along nicely. And if we just hide the plane, I'll just rename this to pavement. It should look in the viewport like the feet are sticking perfectly, which they seem to be. Oh, and even the robot's happy, look. Little cheer at the end. We've finally got her walking along the path. So the next thing I want to do is get the walk so that it's happening all the way along the path. And as the camera turns to the left, I'd like the robot just to be passing by at the same time. So let's have a look at how we can do that. So if we press play, let's just watch where the robot walks to currently and where the camera turns. So the robot's getting to us quite quickly. What we need to do then is modify the speed that the robot's walking. In order to do this, let's go over and create an animation tab. So general, and then animation. Let's zoom out a bit. I'll drag these up, and I want to create a NLA editor, so a nonlinear animation editor, because we're going to be modifying this now. I'm probably going to get rid of the hands going up in the air. So let's turn this off. So now this track is no longer going to be in use, so the hands shouldn't go in the air. Now, we want to choose firstly, before we start positioning the robot, we want to choose how fast we want the robot to walk. So that to me, I think is a little bit too quick. So I'm going to choose the robot. I'm going to go into the end panel, and if you remember, under the properties, we set up a walk speed. I'm going to make it a little bit slower, maybe 0.72. Let's play this back now. We're going full screen. That's a bit more of a relaxed walk. Now the only problem with that is the robot's going to take a lot longer to get to the camera. So we need to somehow move the robot forwards a little bit. And this is quite easy. We'll come out of here. Let's go on to the triangle, because don't forget it's the triangle that's controlling the speed. So over here, click triangle, and we'll just click to show only the selected object, and you see we've got this character move for triangle. If we press tab on this, and then over this one we'll Control Tab to bring up the graph editor. Let's bring this down. And make sure you've only got the eyeball turned on for the Y channel, because you don't want to modify the X or the Z location, or the rotation either. We can control the offset by moving these two up or down. So let's go and select both of those, and then press GY. And if we move the robot, you see, if we move this up and down, the robot's going to be offset so that we can position it so that it passes the camera at the right time. We'll play that back. Now the problem now is, if I just press Tab to come out of here and go back to the NLA editor, it's resized the clip so that it no longer goes to the end of the animation. And that's because if we come over here to the action clip, we've got the sync length, or the tick box, so it automatically changes every time you come out of the edit mode for the clip, so the tweaking mode. It's going to resize it to wherever the keyframes go. So let's untick that. I'll just turn this back up now so it goes all the way to the end. And now the robot should pass by. So just make sure you untick this. We'll come again to the point where the camera turns, which is about here. Going back into tweak mode. GY. And we'll bring it back into view. So it's about here. And come back out of tweak mode, play it back. Not quite enough, so back into tweak mode, GY, oh, not that one, on this graph editor, GY. Let's just hold shift down so we can move it a little bit, probably to about there, and that looks like it might be perfect. Maybe just a tad more. I want it to not quite go out of view that much there. So GY, we'll just move it a bit more. It's about here. Back out. Go back a few frames. That seems to be pretty much perfect. Yeah, that's looking good. And you'll notice at the beginning, the robot is actually behind this tree. And this is going to give us a perfect opportunity later to look at how we can create automatically animated masks that will also conform nicely with rough edges. Like, for example, we've got lots of little branches and twigs and things sticking out of this hedge that we don't want to have a sort of a flat mask around. So we'll look at that later. Of course, an alternative approach is just to start the animation here, and then you don't necessarily need to worry about masks. But I think it's a good thing to know, so we'll cover it later. Now, if your robot isn't quite the right size, the best way to fix that would be to scale the robot and then retime the keyframes for the feet so that they don't slide again. But if you only need to tweak it a little bit, then what we can do is choose the camera, and we can making sure again that the 3D cursor is at world 0 and that we've got that selected as the pivot point and we've got it set to global. We can now scale the camera down or up. Scaling it up will make the character smaller, and this way will make the character larger. So let's just have a look at what's happening in the 3D viewport. I'll just turn the markers back on. When I do that, just got to make sure that the path remains at the same height as those markers. If you go too far, then you're going to have to modify the geometry of the path again to make sure it still remains at the same height as the markers that it's in the vicinity of. So just tweak it as necessary. We can also move the camera on the x-axis to get the robot further away. Just make sure you don't push it so far to the left or right that the robot is no longer walking on the path. I think I prefer the robot a bit bigger in this case, so I'm just going to scale that back up with the camera. Yeah, so we get a bit more of the body on. That's better. And that's that. So we've managed to get the robot into the scene. I'm now going to make a few improvements to the materials, and I might just modify the walk cycle a little bit, because I think the feet should be landing more in the centre rather than sort of looking like she's been riding a horse for 50 years. So I just want to make those feet land a little bit closer together rather than being so wide apart. And it should be child's play by now, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. I'm going to hide all these empties because they're distracting. We'll go to the overlays options, just turn off motion tracking. And I want this character to stay static so that I can see more easily what's happening. So I'll just select the triangle, which is controlling the movement of the character, and then I'll just turn off the NLA track that is responsible for the movement of the triangle. It should stay static, and now we can work a little bit easier. And then we'll choose the character, go into pose mode, and choose this foot. We need to go into the clip that is the walk cycle so we can tweak it. So click on it and then press tab. And before you do that, just make sure that this sync length isn't ticked. So just untick that so it doesn't automatically snap back down to not be long enough. So tab, go into tweak mode, and then if we come in here, we should have all the keyframes visible for this foot that we've got selected. Press Control Tab over the graph editor. This will bring up the dope sheet. So it's this area here that we want to edit. This is the walk cycle area. Now, at the moment, these keyframes aren't landing directly on a frame. So this is going to be problematic, and this is caused because we've actually got if you remember, come over here, we've got this walk speed, which is controlling the scale of the clip, and that is affecting it in here. So we just need to put this back to what it was originally when we first animated the walk cycle. So this was set to 2, so put that to 2. And now this should be the full length, the original length of the animation, and all these little keyframes are going to fall directly on a frame. So that's going to be better. So with that done, into pose mode, and we'll choose the foot. We'll start with the right foot, and we'll press 1 on the numpad to look at front view. I'm going to move this just on the x-axis. Got to be very careful that you don't move it in other directions like the z-axis, otherwise it's going to throw off the entire animation. Making sure you're on frame 1, press G and then X to lock it to the x-axis, and then slide it along. Choose the X location over here, press I, and we'll say only selected channel. I only want to change the current channel that's selected, which is the X channel. So that's created a new keyframe there for us, but as the foot comes back, it's going to slide straight back out. So we come to this frame where it's at the back of the step, and I want to have this be the same X value as the first frame. So I'm going to copy this frame by clicking on it. I press Ctrl C, and because the timeline is in the right location, if I press Ctrl V, it's going to put the foot back. So let's have a look at this. And obviously we don't want the foot to slide out as it goes around, so we'll just get rid of the keyframes in between. So select all these. Be careful to only select the ones you want. So these ones here, and we'll press X. And now when we play it back, it should stay static all the way back on the X-axis. So now we'll move on to this foot, and we'll do the same thing, go into front view, and I'll just move it so it's the same location, same distance from the origin as the other foot. And I'll come over here again, make sure I've got the X track selected, press I, and say only selected channels. So we only modify the X channel. We're going to have the same problem, it's going to slide back out, so we'll get rid of this one. So all these 3 in the middle. Press X, delete those. And then we'll go to the last frame where it needs to be in the same location. Copy this one, Control C, making sure you've still got the X channel selected, and then Control V. And it won't go back because it's a cyclic animation. So we're going to actually come back to the first frame here. And now if we press Control V again, it should snap back. And this foot as well is going to be coming out too fast. We only want it to sort of be back out to its original X location when it's passing the other foot. So that's going to be in the middle about here. So we'll delete the ones either side, this one and this one. And now it'll be much slower to come out as it goes past. Let's try this. Let's go into front view so it's a bit easier to tell. So this foot here isn't working correctly. Let's select that one again. Go back to frame 1. So we need to do the same that we did before on the X location where it's not correct. So just there, we need to make sure we're copying the right X location one. So this one, Control C, Control V, and now, hopefully, it should work correctly. And if we come back out of this view, come out of pose mode, we'll come out of tweak mode down here, and then play this back after enabling this track as well for the character move. So let's turn this track on that controls the speed of the triangle. Turn that on. And it's going to be walking way too slow because we've got it set to 2 for the character. So let's choose the rig, change this back to 0.72, come into camera mode, and then play it back. And it should all be working correctly. It looks slow because I think it's doing the prefetch to put the image sequence into RAM. But if I just go back and play that again, there you go. Now we're getting the correct speed. And the feet are sticking perfectly and everything looks good.